Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I give these speeches so I can get really good introductions, except to Mr. June, but that's okay. I'm just really delighted to be here tonight to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Densho and the 900th interview they've done, and also Tommy Ikeda's 60th birthday, his passage to middle age, even while looking like a graduate student. I even remember meeting Tom in about 1995, just before Densho was starting on the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund. We wanted to give a grant. And Densho folks, it was Scott Oki and it was Tom whom I talked to. And I thought, this is really a worthwhile project. So congratulations on being here tonight. And I really appreciate it. I also wanted to spend just a moment to recognize Bob Santos. He was the first person I met in Seattle in 1974. I just happened to be, I wanted to go to the International District, and I met him. And he took me around. He befriended me and took me to an education seminar. And we were friends ever since then. And I think he was one of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life. So here's to you, Bob, and Sharon, too. You know, I titled my speech, The Mystery of History, because it's always been a mystery to me why people don't learn the lessons of history. You know, as it was said, those who cannot remember the past are deemed to, are condemned to repeat it. And while that's true, history, the concept is way more complex than that, because there are various answers to why history doesn't inform us to make us move forward, or maybe make us move forward as fast as we can. And I've come up with a couple of answers, a number of answers. One is that people just never even know the right history. So when we did the Washington State case with Gary Yamamoto and Rod Kawakami, the vice chancellor told us that, we don't have an Asian American Studies program because it's not important. Japanese American history is not important. Notwithstanding the greatest civil rights tragedy in this country's history, notwithstanding the Japanese American farmers who made the fertile Yakima Valley profitable. The Bing cherry was essentially vented there. The second reason is that people refuse to believe history as it's told. People still claim that Japanese Americans were dangerous when there was no evidence of espionage or sabotage at all. They say the camps were for our own protection, when in fact the guns were pointed inward. And history's lessons are sometimes ignored because it conflicts with present-day interests. So when you think about the war in Vietnam and the lessons that we were all told about how you can't win that type of war, and of course then we go into Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, those decisions are political and they conflict with the lessons that we know about history. Some people don't make the connection between history and the present day. So Donald Trump will say Muslims are unassimilable. It's an echo of what John L. DeWitt said about Japanese Americans when he said the Japanese race is an enemy race. The strains are undiluted, essentially saying that we are inscrutable and unassimilable. And history is also not static. So when it changes, it gets confusing. Think about avocados. I thought you'd like that one, because I love avocados. But years ago, people started saying avocados are not good for you. There's too much fat. And then years later, that whole paradigm changed when they said, well, no, it's good fat. So I was so grateful for the guilty pleasure of guacamole again. But it does create, the knowledge has to be updated, and that's why history is not very static. And I think maybe most significantly, people can understand the basic facts of history, but they don't understand the effect on the subjects of those histories, the human beings involved. It's a matter of empathy. It's a matter of understanding how people feel. And, well, that's kind of an overused or disparaged word in some ways. It may be the most critical factor. So people could say, yeah, the camps were bad. The prisons is what they really mean. But during times of war, everybody has to suffer. Or they say, well, at least the Japanese Americans got free food and lodging. What they don't say is they don't understand the feeling of the loss of dignity, the loss of freedom, the other types of abuses and oppression that Japanese Americans had to live through. They fail to have an emotional attachment to those victims because their experiences are so different. And I think if folks do not have empathy or understand, they kind of rely by default on their own experiences. And they are boxed in their brain and can't think outside the box from their own personal references or experiences and knowledge. Great example of that is down in Santa Clara, near where I live. And a judge there recently sentenced a Stanford athlete to 3 months in prison for raping an unconscious woman. And it so happens that the judge was a Stanford athlete himself, both white males. And he said in his ruling that it would ruin this young man's life if I sent him to prison for a long time, disregarding completely what the effect was on this poor victim, this woman. And it's clear he simply just did not have the empathy for what this woman went through, being dragged down, being raped behind a waste truck. And it's an example in my mind of lack of empathy, because if you can't think outside the box in your head, you're going to have a hard time relating to what happens to other people in other contexts. So the bottom line is teaching and learning history is simply not an easy proposition. But for Japanese Americans, I think we have a unique perspective. We have a unique history. We have the greatest civil rights disaster in our American history, bookended by one of the greatest victories of redress in our history. And within those two bookends, or outside of that really, is a history that's really worth telling. And it's worth telling for a lot of reasons, and one of the most compelling reasons is that it brings us closer to what's happening to people of color in other movements today. For example, we're all ancestors to this country, and the Japanese who came here were greeted essentially, as cheap labor, but then hostility and the strident calls for the exclusion of an entire race from immigrating to this country. It was the first legal wall, or second legal wall, built to exclude a racial group. The first wall was built for Chinese Americans in 1882, and they were disallowed from immigrating to this country too. And it was, I call it, it's a wall, but it's a legal wall. Japanese Americans were denied the right to marry the person they love, if that person was Caucasian. And it was up until 1959 or so. And it's not dissimilar from what the bans on gay marriage, who are denied the right to just marry the person they love. And they suffered, all Japanese Americans suffered the ultimate imprisonment, not the ultimate, the penultimate abuse of being in prison without any of their rights during World War II. So our history mirrors in many ways what's happening in this country to other folks, although we are removed by generations. We think back and think about the immigration discrimination we suffered, the racial discrimination, the racial profiling, and the ban on marriages to the one you love. The cataclysmic event, of course, was the incarceration of Japanese Americans, the forced exile and banishment of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens who were sent to indefinite confinement without any rights, due process rights to a trial, the hearing, notice of charges. And it was justified by military necessity, but essentially the justification was racial ancestry. For what we know now, years later, and what we proved in courts, in case was with Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui in the Koram Nobis cases, and Sharon Sakamoto and Gary Omoto and Rod Kawakami also worked on those cases too, is we proved that what was told to the United States Supreme Court were outright lies about Japanese Americans. And the government attorneys knew it. They had memoranda, reports from the Federal Communications Commission, from the FBI, saying that General DeWitt's claims of espionage are deliberate falsehoods. So they also had reports from credible agencies of the United States government, the Office of Naval Intelligence, Department of Army, who studied the Japanese question and recommended against incarceration. We could do this on the basis of individual loyalty hearings. The lawyers in that case knew about this evidence, and they either altered, suppressed, or destroyed the evidence in order to win their case at all costs. And even after the case, during the middle of the cases, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians issued its report. And its conclusion was that the causes of, historical causes of the incarceration were race discrimination, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. That's the official history. But people today still dispute it, they deny it, they ignore it, and some people never even heard of that historical legacy. But this is where I think the legacy of redress comes in. The movement offers us hope because the redress was an inspired journey for political and psychological redemption of an entire ethnic group. It helped us correct that historical wrong and tell a new story, a new narrative to regain our political birthright. And in winning redress, we gave a gift to this country, a gift of education, a gift of learning about civil rights, a gift about the Constitution, a gift about justice. But we received a gift in return. We found our voices again. The cloud of suspicion and shame was lifted from our community, and we could then participate as full Americans into this enterprise that we call democracy. So the legacy is not just $20,000, an apology, or the Civil Liberties Education Fund. I think the legacy is the moral authority we gain, the voice we gain, to be able to speak out against injustice, to be able to speak out with the credibility of having gone through some of the worst times in American history and come out to be able to regain our dignity and our voices to speak again. I think the true legacy of redress then is to fight for the battle to gain equality for all Americans. And the legacy has gained a lot more significance since September 11th, 2001. And in the ensuing fury and frenzy of that terrible time and that terrible tragedy, the Americans were justifiably outraged. But there was certainly a danger again of that repeating of history, as the danger to a minority group, Muslims and Arab Americans, was increased dramatically. What's heartening to me is the Japanese American Citizens League embraced that legacy. The Japanese American National Museum and Densho were able to speak out and talk about their support for Muslim American and Arab Americans from the depth of their experience to make sure that what was done to Muslim Americans was at least ameliorated to some degree. So that legacy, as I see it, is temporary. We don't win these permanent victories unless we combine the knowledge and the will and activism to tell these stories over and over and retell them. As I said, we won't achieve a permanent victory. And you could look at the Holocaust. People still dispute the Holocaust or deny it happened or it wasn't as bad. And it gets challenged every generation, like the Japanese American incarceration. But I don't think we could repeat history with the same old stories. We have to tell these stories in new ways with fresh eyes and new voices and connect our experience to those of others. And I was thinking the other day about Anne Frank, the Jewish girl who was hiding in an attic in Amsterdam so she could avoid capture by the Nazis and certain death at a Nazi death camp. And through that little attic that her father had built in a hidden part of the house, she had a little window. And in that window, she could see the sky. She could see birds flying by. She could see a chestnut tree that was hanging over through that window. And it was great, gave her great solace. And eventually she was captured. She died in one of those camps. And over the years, that tree began to die. And people were planning to cut it down until folks realized the significance of that tree. And they cut shoots off that tree. And they planted it at places all around the world so that people could remember the horror of the Holocaust and see it in a different light, in a different way, in a different story, so that people will never forget the terrible, terrible events that happened. I think similarly, we're trying to tell our stories as Japanese Americans in new ways. You know, recently Minoru Yasui got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Before him, this is the highest honor you could get as a civilian. Before he got it, Gordon Hirabayashi got it. Fred Korematsu received it. These are all men who defied the military orders against Japanese Americans. And in the awarding of these prestigious medals, we were able to tell the story again in a different way of how these have been resisted and why. Korematsu Day was passed in California, and 10 other states have proclamations. We have buildings named after Gordon Hirabayashi in a professor chair. We have awards named after Min Yasui. Fred Korematsu has 3 schools named after him. A chair at the University of Hawaii, a Korematsu Center here in Seattle, a Korematsu Institute headed by Karen Korematsu, his daughter who's here tonight. And Assemblyman Warren Furutani, a Japanese-American third generation. He's a legislator in the California State Legislature, created this bill so that Japanese-American graduates of college could get their degree, even though they were taken away during the middle of their studies to go to prison. The Art of Gaman, if you haven't read it or seen it, it's a picture book of some of the artistic works just cobbled together by scraps of materials that the Japanese Americans found in their camps. And the beauty of it is that it tells the story in a different way, that the spirit of humanity or the human spirit of Japanese Americans, despite their being interned or incarcerated, was not crushed. If you ever see the Nisei Fishermen's Club, it's a video that's on DV. It tells a story about these Niseis who would sneak out of camps at Manzanar and go fishing so they could catch trout. And that represented to them the breath of freedom that they lacked in camps. We also see the Nisei Veterans Committee, the Go for Brokes, a Veterans Memorial. That directs the nation's attention, not only to the courage of these brave men whose lives were risked and who did so much during World War II, but also points out the irony of these men fighting for the freedom of our country while their families were incarcerated in prison. Last Thursday, just a few days ago, I introduced George Takei, who received an award in San Francisco. And he told a very poignant story about growing up both in rural Arkansas and in Tule Lake, and what a terrible, terrible tragedy the incarceration was. When public speakers or public figures like George Takei, Norm Mineta does this all the time as well, speak out, people will listen. And it helps people remember the injustice of the incarceration again. And of course, we have Densho. Earlier, and I'm smiling because I just think this is such a wonderful project, I mentioned empathy as a pathway to appreciating history. I think, as was said earlier, that telling the stories firsthand, when you see human faces talking about what they went through, people crying, it takes the message into somebody's heart. And if you could change this person's heart, you can change their mind. And I think that's what Densho is doing. And I read this quote for you because it occurred to me as being very essentially Densho. Well, it is because Tom Ikeda said it. But I was going to leave that for the end, but he would have heard it. He would have remembered. In the past month, I've also seen some concrete ways that these interviews are making a difference in the world today. In preparing for the gala, we solicited testimony from the great grandchildren and great-grandchildren of our interviewees. The responses we received were incredibly moving and showed that the stories we recorded teach important lessons about racial justice and equality. Again, when it's told by living persons, the effect on the hearer just multiplies. I was interviewed by Densho early on. That was a long interview, too. And, I'm glad it's still around because I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old daughter. I started very late in life. I was a little bit slow, so it's kind of surreal. But they know me as Daddy. And I want my children to see that interview someday so they will know who I am and who I was and what I fought for and why I fought for. I also want them to know and see me when I had a lot of hair. Because they make fun of me all the time now. Kids. I think another way to ensure the legacy is to connect our stories to other marginalized groups, because it emphasizes the communalities in our history and experiences. I've already talked about immigration, marriage, and racial profiling. But by connecting our stories and our history, we can understand and empathize with other groups, and vice versa. And we can forge the political alliances that we lacked in 1942, but which we gained in the 1980s when redress was successful. We can, for example, appreciate the surveillance of Muslims and hate crimes, which have increased dramatically since the wall guy declared Mexicans, Muslims, and Syrians should not belong in this country. We can relate to the Chinese-American scientists, 5 of them who were arrested, just embarrassingly taken to prison, indicted, and every one of those charges were dismissed. They were charged with espionage, and they found out that essentially because they were Chinese. Is a case of racial profiling, and it sounds essentially like the reprise of John L. DeWitt's claim of espionage of Japanese Americans, which the FCC and the FBI said were outright lies that John DeWitt told. So there's a new crime. We call it downloading while Asian, and just please don't get caught. But we can also make the psychological leap, it's a small step, to the Black Lives Matter movement, because maybe we don't suffer the same kind of indignities daily, or have to tell our children, please be careful. You know, if you see a police officer, geez, be afraid and be respectful. There's so many things that African Americans have to experience that we don't experience, but we can understand the concept of racial profiling. And it came home to me a little more deeply when I read an interview of an African American professor at San Francisco State, where I live in San Francisco. And in the last number of years, he was stopped 35 times. And he said he was wearing a suit most of the time, stopped by police. And it resulted in not one arrest, but each time he thought he was going to be killed. So it's an experience that while we don't have directly, we could think about that and perhaps understand and empathize. So in the end, let's just remember the lessons that history is not static, that the enemies of history, people like Michelle Malkin, need to be confronted, need to be opposed. And we marry activism with the knowledge of history, because justice is not self-executing. It is not a gift. It's a challenge. And we cannot rely just on our institutions to protect us. We need allies of all colors and races like we had for the redress movement. We should understand that dissent is not the enemy of patriotism. Fred Gordon Min, the Heart Mountain Resistors, the 1800th Battalion, all dissented, and they acted with the noblest of motives. They were reviled. They were pariahs. They were outcasts. They were called disloyal. But today, we call them heroes, because history has proven them right. In 1942, very few people dissented from the government's decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans. The president issued Executive Order 9066. Congress supported him unanimously, and the Supreme Court meekly acquiesced to the government's false claims, and we experienced a civil rights disaster. We have to know that it's our political birthright to dissent. It's our historical legacy. I think it's our duty as Americans to do so. So I hope we can use our knowledge of history, our moral authority, our will to do something, to speak out, to ensure that the terrible injustices that we've experienced as a people will never be repeated. I thank you very much.